Early in 1942, American aviators who first engaged Japanese Zero fighters over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean returned with accounts so incredible they bordered on tall tales, yet their implications were gravely serious. These pilots recounted encounters with an adversary aircraft possessing a turning capability that surpassed anything the United States Navy or Army Air Forces could deploy into the skies. The Mitsubishi A6M80, as it was designated, was not merely proficient, its performance was frighteningly superior, a factor that was directly contributing to the mounting casualties among American airmen. On February 20, 1942, during the inaugural Japanese aerial assault on Darwin, Australia, a formation of 9 Zeros, tasked with escorting bombers, stumbled upon a hastily launched contingent of P-40 Warhawks. The ensuing aerial skirmish was swift, concluding in a matter of minutes. The Zeros successfully downed 4 P-40s, without sustaining any losses themselves. The American pilots who survived this harrowing engagement consistently reported an identical and deeply frustrating pattern. Every attempt to outmaneuver a Zero in a turn to bring their weapons to bear resulted in failure. The Japanese fighter consistently executed a tighter turn, effortlessly slipping within their turning radius, and invariably ended up directly on their tail. It was akin to attempting an intricate dance with the agility of a ballerina, while being encumbered by leaden boots. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The statistical data from those initial months painted a grim picture. Across the Philippines, over Wake Island, and throughout the Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots confronted a stark numerical disadvantage. The Zero could execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat speeds. In contrast, the F-4F Wildcat, which served as America's principal carrier-based fighter, required around 19 seconds to complete the same maneuver. The P-40 Warhawk, regrettably, demanded even more time. While a mere 3-second difference may seem negligible, in the context of a turning dogfight, those crucial seconds meant the Zero could finalize its turn, achieve a firing solution, and unleash devastating 20mm cannon rounds through an American cockpit. All while the American pilot was still laboriously maneuvering their aircraft, desperately striving to point its nose at an empty patch of sky. Yet, raw statistics only convey a partial understanding of the situation. The Zero achieved its extraordinary turning prowess through a radically innovative design philosophy. Japanese engineers meticulously crafted an aircraft with an astonishingly low empty weight of just 5,300 pounds, roughly 2/3 the mass of an F-4F Wildcat. This significant weight reduction was accomplished by systematically eliminating nearly all armor protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks, and only minimal armored plating was positioned behind the pilot's seat. Essentially, the Zero was a potent engine encased in what amounted to tissue paper, a design choice that explicitly prioritized sheer maneuverability at the expense of survivability. American pilots, at this early stage, were unaware of these design specifics, but they undeniably experienced the dire consequences. Each engagement unfolded with a distressing predictability. American pilots would detect Zeros, initiate a dive to attack, perhaps manage to unleash a brief burst of gunfire, and then the Zeros would respond by turning to engage. The moment an American pilot attempted to engage in a turning fight, to maneuver their aircraft in a horizontal circular pattern to track the enemy, they were irrevocably defeated. The Zero would simply outturn them, transitioning from a defensive posture to an offensive one in mere seconds. Experienced pilots developed a profound sense of dread as they pulled back on the control stick, acutely aware that they were committing to a contest they were destined to lose. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley articulated the gravity of the situation in March 1942, following engagements near Guadalcanal. He stated, "It's not that our boys lack courage or skill. They have both in abundance, but they're trying to fight by the rules. And the rules don't work anymore. We're teaching them to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight against Zeros. That's teaching them to die." His poignant words struck at the very core of the crisis confronting American naval aviation. The entire doctrine of fighter combat, meticulously developed over years of rigorous training and theoretical exploration, had been rendered obsolete within a matter of weeks. The crisis extended far beyond the individual survival of pilots. Air superiority in the Pacific theater fundamentally hinged on prevailing in these fighter versus fighter engagements. If American fighters proved incapable of safeguarding dive bombers and torpedo planes, then carrier task forces would be unable to execute effective strikes against Japanese targets. Conversely, if fighters could not adequately protect bases and bomber formations, America's offensive capabilities would simply evaporate. The Zero problem was not merely a challenge in dogfighting. It imperiled the entire strategic framework in the Pacific. Pilots began to refer to this chilling realization as Zero fever. It was that precise moment of cold, stark understanding during a turning fight with a Japanese fighter, when one comprehended that the enemy would complete his turn before they could. Some pilots became paralyzed by this realization. Others executed desperate maneuvers that only exacerbated their peril. A select few, however, began to think unconventionally, and these individuals started to discern something peculiar about the Zero's behavioral patterns in combat. Commander John Smith Thatch, universally known as Jimmy, grappled with a persistent problem that robbed him of sleep aboard the USS Lexington in early 1942. As the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he bore the profound responsibility of preserving the lives of his pilots as they confronted an enemy aircraft that demonstrably outclassed their Wildcats in virtually every quantifiable metric. Thack was an atypical naval officer for his era. He was not content simply to fly. He was a dedicated scholar of aerial combat. While other squadron commanders prioritized gunnery practice and formation flying, Thatch devoted countless hours to meticulously scrutinizing after-action reports, thoroughly debriefing returning pilots, and meticulously performing calculations on scraps of paper. By April 1942, Thatch had amassed sufficient data to clearly discern a recurring pattern. American pilots who managed to survive encounters with Zeros consistently shared similar experiences. They described how the Zero pilot would tenaciously lock onto a target and pursue it through a turning engagement with an almost preternatural precision. The Japanese pilot, secure in the knowledge that his aircraft could outturn any American counterpart, would commit fully to the turn, relentlessly tightening his radius, and willingly accepting higher G-forces, confident that his quarry would inevitably reach its turning performance limits first. This profound confidence, Thatch realized, had become predictable, and predictability, he shrewdly deduced, could be exploited. Thach also observed another detail during the debriefings, one that most officers casually dismissed as combat stress or confused recollection. Multiple pilots reported that when they had attempted radical maneuvers, sudden, unexpected dives, abrupt climbs, or aggressive reductions in throttle, Zero pilots sometimes appeared momentarily surprised. The Japanese flyers had grown accustomed to American pilots engaging in a particular manner, maintaining speed, attempting to turn, and ultimately perishing. Any deviation from this established pattern seemed to momentarily disorient the enemy. These were fleeting moments, usually insufficient to save the pilot's life, but they were moments nonetheless. The pivotal breakthrough occurred when Thach interviewed Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare after his extraordinary performance on February 20th, 1942. O'Hare had single-handedly defended the Lexington against a formation of 9 Japanese bombers, successfully shooting down 5. However, what truly captivated Thach's attention was not the bombers, but rather how O'Hare had engaged the escorting Zeros. O'Hare recounted executing high-speed slashing attacks, firing his weapons, and then resolutely refusing to engage in a turning fight. Instead, he exploited his Wildcat's superior diving speed to disengage, rapidly zooming back to altitude, converting that speed into energy, and then attacking once more. He steadfastly refused to allow any Zero to draw him into a protracted turning engagement. Thach commenced conducting experiments using matchsticks on his desk, meticulously simulating various tactical approaches. The core problem was isolation. If a Zero secured a position on your tail and you were unable to outturn it, your fate was sealed. But what if you were not alone? What if your wingman could be transformed into a weapon? He manipulated the matchsticks in crossing patterns, devising scenarios where a Zero pursuing one Wildcat would inevitably fly directly into the line of fire of another. The underlying geometry was straightforward, but its execution demanded impeccable coordination and absolute trust between pilots. On May 10, 1942, Thach assembled his squadron pilots in the Lexington's ready room and elucidated the revolutionary concept he had developed. He christened it the beam defense position, although it would forever be immortalized as the Thach weave. The fundamental concept was groundbreaking. Instead of fighting as individual aircraft, 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses, maintaining a separation of approximately 200 feet. When a Zero initiated an attack on one of the planes, both Wildcats would simultaneously turn toward each other in a crisscross pattern. The Zero, having committed to pursuing the first Wildcat through its turn, would suddenly find the second Wildcat crossing directly in front of its nose, guns blazing. If the Zero disengaged to avoid being shot, the first Wildcat was safe. If the Zero persisted in its pursuit, it would fly directly into a devastating hail of 50 caliber bullets. However, Thach was developing more than just the weave. He was systematically documenting something far more fundamental about Zero tactics. Japanese pilots, he observed, had fallen into predictable patterns of engagement, born from their aircraft's inherent superiority. They anticipated American pilots to fight in specific ways, to turn, to attempt to dogfight, to adhere to rules that inherently favored the Zero. This ingrained expectation created a form of tunnel vision. Zero pilots would commit to pursuit with such unwavering confidence that they would often disregard crucial warning signs. They would unhesitatingly follow American fighters into situations that a more cautious pilot would readily recognize as calculated traps. Thatch shared his invaluable observations with every squadron commander who was willing to listen. He authored detailed tactical memos that circulated throughout the fleet. Some of his innovative ideas were initially dismissed. Senior officers who had never personally confronted a Zero believed Thatch was unnecessarily overcomplicating simple fighter tactics. Yet the pilots who had survived the crucible of combat in the South Pacific devoured Thatch's reports as if they were sacred texts. Here was an individual who profoundly understood the formidable challenges they faced and who was systematically devising practical solutions, rather than merely demanding more courage or superior gunnery skills. The prevailing sentiment suggested that victory in aerial engagements hinged either on a greater display of bravery or on more precise marksmanship. However, the true crucible for these theories and emerging tactics was destined to be the pivotal Battle of Midway. The innovative Thatch Weave, conceived by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thack, initially appeared utterly preposterous when examined purely theoretically. Conventional naval aviation principles, deeply ingrained since the Great War, primarily stressed the critical importance of maintaining cohesive formation integrity, providing reciprocal assistance through established defensive circular patterns, and cultivating exceptional individual skill in close-quarters aerial combat. Yet, Thatch was now instructing his aviators to intentionally maneuver towards an adversary, to intersect their flight trajectories with their wingmen at considerable velocities, and to place their faith in the intricate interplay of geometric positioning and impeccable synchronization as their primary means of survival, rather than relying on their aircraft's inherent superiority in turning capabilities. This radical concept fundamentally contravened every deeply ingrained instinct and established operational procedure that fighter pilots had meticulously cultivated and relied upon throughout their training and combat experience. During the arduous sea journey towards Midway, in the waning days of May 1942, Thack subjected his pilots to an unyielding and rigorous training regimen. In these intensive practice sessions, a pair of Grumman F-4F Wildcats would repeatedly launch and execute the intricate scissoring motion. The pilots would maneuver their aircraft to turn directly towards each other, pass in close proximity, then swiftly reverse course and pass again, continuously repeating this precise sequence. This dynamic pattern effectively generated a tightly interwoven defensive zone, rendering it exceedingly difficult, if not virtually impossible, for a lone attacking aircraft to successfully breach. Nevertheless, the successful execution of this maneuver demanded nothing less than absolute, unerring precision. A mere lapse in timing, even by a fraction of a second, carried the catastrophic risk of a mid-air collision between the two Wildcats. Should one pilot falter with hesitation or inaccurately assess the critical crossing point, the entire defensive weave would instantaneously unravel, leaving both aircraft dangerously exposed and vulnerable to enemy assault. Time. Twos. Thack's dedicated airmen honed their skills through incessant practice until this complex maneuver transitioned from a conscious effort to an ingrained instinctive response, enabling them to flawlessly execute it, even amidst the intense pressure of enemy fire, with adrenaline coursing through their veins and their hands trembling with tension. We encourage you to stay with us as we delve deeper into these pivotal tactical innovations and witness their ultimate impact by watching the conclusion of this presentation. Your engagement, expressed through a like and a subscription, would be profoundly appreciated. Furthermore, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below, letting us know where you are joining us from and what your perspective is on the crucial topics discussed in this video. The climactic day of June 4th, 1942, irrevocably marked by the Battle of Midway, offered the definitive proving ground for Thach's audacious theory. At the helm of his flight division, comprising 6 Wildcats, Thach meticulously provided escort to the vulnerable torpedo bombers as they launched their daring assault against the formidable Japanese carrier fleet. Precisely at EUO 9:20 hours, a formidable contingent of Mitsubishi A6M0s descended upon the American formation with overwhelming numbers. Thach observed his gravest fears rapidly materializing. Over a dozen agile Zeros were aggressively diving upon his significantly outnumbered Wildcats. Without a moment's hesitation, he initiated the renowned weave maneuver with his steadfast wingman, Ensign Robert Ramdib. In a flash, a relentless Zero fastened itself onto Thach's tail, pursuing him into the turn with a characteristic, almost predictable, ferocity. The Japanese aviator, exhibiting unwavering commitment to the chase and absolute confidence in his aircraft's renowned turning superiority, focused his entire attention on the American target directly ahead, flying precisely as Thach's theoretical models had anticipated. Ensign Dib executed a decisive maneuver, crossing directly in front of Thach, with their aircraft converging at an astonishing combined speed approaching 500 miles per hour. The pursuing Zero pilot, caught completely by surprise, abruptly discovered himself hurtling straight into the lethal crosshairs of Dib's guns, afforded a mere 2 seconds or even less to register a reaction. Dib's 6 formidable 50 caliber machine guns unleashed a devastating torrent of fire, utterly shredding the Zero's lightly armored airframe. The Japanese aircraft, unable to withstand the barrage, disintegrated violently in midair. Thach, with remarkable agility, instantaneously reversed his turn, skillfully weaving back across Dib's flight path. Consequently, another Zero, which had been relentlessly pursuing Dib, now confronted precisely the same perilous geometric predicament. Thach's own guns were now unmistakably aimed directly at this new adversary. The Zero pilot, confronted with the stark reality of imminent destruction, decisively disengaged from the attack, unwilling to confront what appeared to be certain demise. In a span of less than 30 seconds, the innovative weave maneuver had successfully annihilated one Zero and compelled another to abandon its aggressive pursuit. This intense aerial confrontation persisted for a duration of nearly 20 minutes. Thach's division maintained their disciplined weaving, consistently crossing paths and turning towards one another rather than attempting to evade independently. The Japanese Zeros, whose pilots were accustomed to systematically isolating and eliminating lone American fighters with relative ease, found themselves utterly incapable of penetrating the resilient, interlocking formation. Each instance a Zero pilot committed to an aggressive attack, he inevitably flew directly into a lethal crossfire from the American Wildcats. Japanese aviators, who had become complacent with the perceived predictability of American aerial tactics, were abruptly confronted with an entirely novel and disorienting defensive strategy. Some, exhibiting a degree of adaptability, recognized the futility of their efforts and broke off their attacks. Others, however, remained rigidly fixated in their ingrained offensive mindset, pressed their assaults forward with fatal determination, and perished. By the time Thach's division successfully returned to the aircraft carrier Yorktown, they had achieved 3 confirmed 0 kills and had effectively repelled at least 5 additional enemy aircraft. Crucially, their tenacious defense had safeguarded the vulnerable torpedo bombers for a sufficient period, allowing their attack sequence to unfold, despite the fact that the torpedo assault itself ultimately proved largely ineffectual due to an array of other unforeseen tactical complications. News of the ingenious weave maneuver rapidly disseminated throughout the entire Pacific Fleet within a matter of days. Aviators, who had previously grappled with feelings of helplessness when pitted against the formidable Zeros, now possessed a tangible and demonstrably effective defensive tactic. Yet, the weave transcended the simple definition of a clever operational maneuver. It embodied a profound paradigm shift. This innovation fundamentally redefined the conceptual framework through which American pilots approached fighter combat. The antiquated doctrine had placed an overarching emphasis on the singular prowess of individual pilots and the inherent performance characteristics of their aircraft. In stark contrast, the nascent doctrine championed the critical importance of cohesive teamwork, rigorous tactical discipline, and the strategic exploitation of enemy psychological tendencies. The profound realization emerged: one did not necessarily need to outperform a Zero in a turning engagement if one could strategically outmaneuver the Zero pilot mentally. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater, various fighter squadrons promptly commenced the process of adapting the Thach weave to suit their specific operational requirements and aircraft types. Certain iterations of the maneuver involved the deployment of 4 aircraft instead of the original 2, thereby generating even more intricate and multi-layered crossing patterns. Other units meticulously adjusted the precise timing and spatial separation of their aircraft, tailoring these parameters according to whether they were operating Grumman Wildcats, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, or the newly arriving Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, which were just beginning to be introduced into the operational theater. Despite these numerous adaptations, the fundamental underlying principle remained steadfast and unwavering: always turn directly towards your wingman. This action was designed to compel the enemy to make a critical, immediate decision: either disengage from the attack or risk flying directly into a concentrated hail of gunfire. And perhaps most crucially, the overarching directive was to consistently avoid engaging in combat in the manner that the adversary anticipated. The psychological ramifications experienced by Japanese pilots were undeniably profound and far-reaching. Comprehensive intelligence reports, meticulously compiled from a combination of captured enemy documents and detailed interrogations of prisoners of war, unequivocally indicated that by the latter half of 1942, Zero pilots had adopted a noticeably more circumspect and cautious approach to aerial combat engagements. The era of effortless victories, which had characterized the initial months of 1942, had unequivocally concluded. American formations that employed the weaving and scissoring tactics presented a level of danger that extended far beyond mere numerical disadvantages. The inherent Japanese tactical superiority, primarily their aircraft's exceptional maneuverability, had been effectively nullified, not through a leap in engineering prowess or aircraft design, but rather through the strategic application of superior tactical foresight and innovative thinking. While Lieutenant Commander Thach's innovative weave successfully provided an effective solution for the immediate peril of having a Zero positioned on one's tail, it conspicuously failed to resolve a more fundamental and persistent query that continually troubled American fighter pilots. How does one effectively engage an adversary whose aircraft possesses superior turning capabilities without first having to endure the disadvantage of being attacked? The profound answer to this critical strategic dilemma emerged from an unexpected origin: a cadre of pilots who had managed to survive aerial encounters by resolutely refusing to engage in traditional dogfighting altogether. These astute aviators had inadvertently discovered a revolutionary concept that would subsequently form the foundational cornerstone of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the protracted conflict: the principle of energy fighting. Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223, made his arrival at Guadalcanal's strategically vital Henderson Field in August 1942, bringing with him a remarkably straightforward yet profoundly impactful philosophy that he meticulously instilled into every single pilot under his command: altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death. Smith had dedicated himself to an obsessive study of the initial combat reports emerging from the Pacific Theater, ultimately reaching a conclusion that, to the more conventionally oriented fighter pilots, might have appeared almost timid or even cowardly under no circumstances whatsoever should one attempt to engage a Zero in a turning fight. Instead, his pilots were instructed to leverage the singular, undeniable advantage their aircraft genuinely possessed: their superior diving speed and robust structural integrity. The underlying physical principles governing this new approach were remarkably uncomplicated and direct. A fully loaded Grumman Wildcat typically registered a weight of approximately 7,900 pounds, a significant difference when juxtaposed against the Zero's comparatively lighter 5,300 pounds. In a scenario of level flight, assuming identical speeds, both aircraft would theoretically possess an equivalent amount of kinetic energy. However, during a sustained dive, the inherently heavier Wildcat would accelerate at a more rapid rate and was capable of attaining considerably higher velocities before encountering its structural limitations. The Zero's lightweight construction, precisely the characteristic that endowed it with its exceptional turning agility, paradoxically transformed into a critical vulnerability during aggressive vertical maneuvers. Zero pilots who attempted to dive too vehemently risked severely overstressing and potentially damaging their airframes. Conversely, American aviators operating Wildcats, P-40 Warhawks, and particularly the robust Republic P-47 Thunderbolts that were subsequently introduced into service, could execute dives at speeds that were sufficient to literally tear a Zero apart in midair. Smith's pilots meticulously executed a tactical maneuver that swiftly became known as boom and zoom attacks. Their operational procedure involved patrolling at significantly elevated altitudes, characteristically at 20,000 feet or even higher, thereby consistently preserving what aviators termed an energy advantage. Upon visually acquiring Zeros positioned beneath them, they would initiate a rapid, high-speed dive, unleash a swift, concentrated burst of gunfire at their designated target, and then skillfully utilize the momentum generated by their diving speed to rapidly zoom back up to their original high altitude, all before the Zeros had an opportunity to effectively react or retaliate. Each individual attack typically transpired within a mere matter of seconds. Should the initial burst connect with its intended mark, the Zero would invariably plummet from the sky. If the shot unfortunately missed, the American pilot exhibited no inclination to linger or assess the outcome. Instead, he efficiently converted his accumulated speed back into altitude, promptly repositioning himself to set up for a subsequent assault. The Zeros below could engage in as many turns and evasive maneuvers as their pilots desired. They simply lacked the capability to intercept or engage an aircraft that steadfastly refused to compete within their preferred operational arena. Captain Joe Foss, an aviator who would ultimately conclude the war as one of America's preeminent aces, credited with an impressive tally of 26 aerial victories, articulated the core tenets of the energy fighting doctrine in remarkably forthright language during a debriefing session held in November 1942. He unequivocally stated, "The Zero explicitly desires for you to engage in a turning fight. That is precisely his preferred domain. Therefore, simply refuse to participate in that particular game. Maintain a superior altitude above him. Consistently preserve your speed. Strike him decisively when he is unaware of your presence and disengage swiftly before he can mount any effective response. This approach is not predicated on demonstrating bravery or endeavoring to prove one's superior piloting skills in a supposedly equitable engagement. Rather, its sole purpose is the successful elimination of the enemy and the safe return of oneself to base." Captain Foss's potent declaration encapsulated the profound and fundamental alteration in strategic mindset that was rapidly permeating throughout the entirety of the Pacific theater of operations. The sophisticated concept of energy management extended far beyond the rudimentary actions of merely diving and climbing. Aviators were meticulously educated to conceptualize their aircraft not simply as a machine, but as a dynamic reservoir of inherent energy, which manifested in two distinct yet interconnected forms: kinetic energy, derived directly from the aircraft's velocity, and potential energy, attributable to its altitude. Every single maneuver executed by an aircraft either expended a portion of this energy or involved the judicious exchange of one form of energy for the other. For instance, a sharply executed turn invariably resulted in a significant dissipation of airspeed, effectively converting kinetic energy into angular momentum, and through the inevitable forces of air resistance, into unproductive waste heat. Conversely, a climb fundamentally involved the trade of kinetic energy for an increase in potential energy. A dive naturally performed the reciprocal function. The overarching strategic objective became the sustained maintenance of a higher total energy state than one's adversary, a condition that inherently conferred upon the pilot the decisive advantage of dictating the precise terms and parameters of engagement. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, an insightful naval aviator who had previously expressed considerable dismay regarding the inherent inadequacies of conventional dogfighting tactics, emerged as one of the most fervent and articulate proponents for the revolutionary concept of energy fighting. By September of 1942, he had meticulously devised and implemented a comprehensive training curriculum that effectively utilized practical chalk talks and illustrative blackboard diagrams. These pedagogical tools were specifically designed to instruct pilots on how to intuitively visualize and comprehend the dynamic energy states of aircraft during the intense crucible of combat. In his teaching methodology, he would frequently sketch two aircraft on the blackboard and pose a crucial hypothetical scenario. This Zero is currently operating at an altitude of 15,000 feet, maintaining a speed of 180 knots. You, on the other hand, are positioned at 20,000 feet, flying at 250 knots. Which aircraft possesses the distinct energy advantage? The unequivocal response, consistently reinforced, was always the aircraft that commanded a greater total sum of energy. And crucially, that particular aircraft held the strategic prerogative to determine whether to initiate an engagement or to tactically disengage. Fighters faced a critical decision whether to engage in combat or retreat. This particular method demanded a level of self-control that directly contradicted the inherent aggressive tendencies of every fighter pilot. When a pilot executed a dive attack on a Zero and failed to hit the target, their immediate instinct was to perform a tight turn and attempt another pass. Having just descended rapidly over 5,000 feet at an exhilarating velocity, with the adversary clearly within sight, re-engaging felt like the most natural course of action. However, such a turn would inevitably deplete all accumulated speed. Instantly, the pilot would find themselves in the same energy state as the Zero, sluggish and susceptible to attack. The Zero pilot, who moments earlier had been on the defensive, could then swiftly reverse the combat scenario. Pilots who succumbed to this powerful temptation often met a grim fate. The throttle-down overshoot technique materialized from dire circumstances where all other strategies had already failed. A pilot might have forfeited their altitude advantage, or a Zero might have successfully positioned itself on their tail despite their best evasive maneuvers. The thatch weave, a defensive formation, was not an option because their wingman was engaged elsewhere in their own struggle. The established doctrine of energy fighting dictated that a pilot should never find themselves in such a precarious situation. Yet, combat is inherently chaotic, and sometimes theoretical principles collide with harsh reality in the most unfortunate ways. It was in these moments that pilots discovered the throttle lever itself could be transformed into a potent weapon. Ensign James Sweat inadvertently stumbled upon this groundbreaking technique on April 7, 1943, amidst a massive Japanese aerial assault on Guadalcanal. A Zero had latched onto his tail after Sweat had expended his altitude and speed advantages during a frantic dogfight with enemy dive bombers. Sweat was violently maneuvering his Wildcat, but the skilled Zero pilot mirrored every turn, steadily closing the distance between them. His aircraft was already compromised, leaking hydraulic fluid, and he realized he had perhaps only 30 seconds before the enemy's 20mm cannons would shred his empennage. In a moment of sheer desperation, he executed an action that defied every ingrained instinct. He abruptly reduced his throttle to idle. The effect was instantaneous and astonishing. The Wildcat's dramatic deceleration violently propelled Sweat forward against his shoulder harness. Behind him, the Zero pilot, who had been meticulously tracking his target's speed and adjusting his own throttle to maintain a prime firing position, was caught off guard. When Sweat's aircraft suddenly slowed, the Zero's considerable momentum carried it forcefully forward. In the lexicon of aerial combat, this phenomenon is termed an overshoot. The Zero hurtled past Sweat's left wing, instantly transforming from the hunter to the hunted. Sweat then slammed his throttle fully forward, gently elevated his nose, and unleashed a 2-second burst of gunfire into the Zero's vulnerable belly as it momentarily hung in front of him. The Japanese aircraft immediately inverted and plummeted into the ocean below. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. The fundamental physics underpinning the throttle-down overshoot are deeply rooted in the principles of momentum and human reaction time. An aircraft cruising at 280 mph traverses approximately 410 feet per second. When a pursuing pilot observes their target suddenly decelerate, a sequence of events unfolds. Initially, there is a recognition lag. The human brain requires roughly half a second to register that the target's speed has altered. This is followed by a decision lag, another quarter of a second needed to determine the appropriate response. Finally, there is an action lag, the time it takes to physically move one's hand to the throttle or control stick. By the time the pursuing pilot has successfully reduced power and applied the necessary back pressure to prevent overshooting, they have already closed the distance by an additional 200 to 300 feet beyond their initial intention. However, the effective application of this technique was far more intricate than merely retracting the throttle and hoping for a favorable outcome. Pilots who survived to refine this method discovered that impeccable timing and acute situational awareness were paramount. One could not reduce throttle too early, as the pursuing pilot would have ample time to adjust. Simply slowing down in unison and maintaining their advantageous firing position. Conversely, reducing throttle too late was equally perilous. If the enemy was already within effective firing range, such a maneuver would merely present an easier target. The optimal moment, the sweet spot, was when the pursuing aircraft was approximately 2 to 3 seconds from its ideal firing position, close enough that the pilot's focus was entirely on their gun sight and target tracking, rather than on executing broad maneuvering adjustments. This technique also necessitated a profound understanding of the pursuer's tactical mindset. By mid-1943, Zero pilots had developed specific attack patterns refined over hundreds of successful engagements. They would typically close to within 200 feet, settle into a position slightly behind and below their target, and then unleash a methodical burst aimed at the cockpit and engine. This consistent and predictable attack profile made it susceptible to exploitation. A Zero pilot who had committed to this killing shot had already dedicated their aircraft to a specific flight path and speed. They anticipated their target would either maintain speed or desperately attempt to accelerate. A sudden and unexpected deceleration was simply not part of their established tactical playbook. Marine Captain Jefferson de Blanc, credited with 9 victories during the Guadalcanal campaign, eloquently described teaching the throttle-down technique to newly arrived replacement pilots in early 1943. He instructed them to conceptualize it as a reverse game of chicken. The Zero pilot, confident of victory, believes they have secured the kill and are settling in for the final shot. This very confidence renders them predictable. When a pilot abruptly chops the throttle, they are wagering that the enemy's momentum and ingrained expectations will carry them past before they can adequately react. It is an inherently unsettling sensation. Speed plummets, controls become sluggish, and every instinct screams that one is making a grave error. Yet if executed with precision, it grants 1 or 2 precious seconds where the enemy is suddenly in front and the pilot remains alive and able to fire. The throttle-down maneuver, however, was not without its limitations, which pilots painstakingly learned through rigorous trial and error. It was essentially a single-use trick. Once executed, a pilot would have bled off the majority of their air speed and energy. If the pilot missed their shot when the enemy overshot, they would find themselves in dire straits, slow, vulnerable, and devoid of any energy reserve. Furthermore, it proved ineffective against multiple attackers. While one might successfully compel a single Zero to overshoot, its wingman would simply adjust their position and engage during the vulnerable, low-speed recovery. The pivotal Battle of Midway in June 1942 had unequivocally validated Thach's weave under intense combat conditions. However, it was Guadalcanal that truly emerged as the proving ground where energy tactics and meticulous throttle management transitioned from experimental techniques into standard operational doctrine. Henderson Field, secured by Marines on August 7, 1942, became the epicenter of a brutal 6-month attrition known to pilots as the Slot. Japanese aircraft routinely flew down from Rabaul almost daily, and American fighters launched from Henderson's muddy, shell-shocked runway to intercept them. This was where theoretical principles repeatedly clashed with harsh reality, violently and without mercy. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, under the command of Major John L. Smith, arrived at Henderson on August 20, 1942, equipped with 19 Wildcats. Smith's pilots had been thoroughly immersed in the core tenets of energy fighting principles long before their deployment to Guadalcanal. No turning with Zeros. Maintain altitude. Dive. Shoot. Climb. On August 24th, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith's squadron intercepted a substantial formation of Japanese bombers escorted by their Zero fighters. The Marines maintained a high altitude, dove through the Zero screen at speeds exceeding 350 mph, successfully shot down 4 bombers in their initial pass, and then zoomed back to altitude before the Zeros could mount an effective counter-response. The surviving Zero pilots twisted and turned below, futilely demonstrating their aircraft's superior maneuverability to empty sky, while Smith's pilots meticulously prepared for another devastating diving attack. The combat statistics from those initial weeks at Guadalcanal revealed a remarkable narrative. In August 1942, Marine and Navy fighters operating from Henderson Field successfully shot down 42 Japanese aircraft while incurring the loss of 16 of their own, yielding an impressive ratio of approximately 2.6 to 1. In stark contrast, the fighting in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies just 6 months prior had often seen ratios that favored the Japanese. The decisive factor was not superior aircraft. The Wildcats at Guadalcanal were the identical models that had struggled earlier in the conflict. The fundamental difference lay in tactics. American pilots were no longer engaging in combat in a manner that played into the Zero's design advantages. Captain Marion Carl, who achieved the distinction of becoming the first Marine Corps ace at Guadalcanal, recounted a typical engagement on September 9, 1942, which vividly illustrated how throttle management had become an integral part of standard combat procedure. Carl had initiated a bounce attack on a Zero from a superior altitude, completed his firing pass, and was climbing back to altitude when he observed that his speed had diminished more than he had intended. A second Zero had deftly maneuvered behind him during his ascent. Carl deliberately continued his climb for another 3 seconds, meticulously watching his airspeed indicator drop from 210 to 180 knots, allowing the Zero to close the distance. He then simultaneously reduced his throttle to idle and deployed his landing flaps, a synchronized double deceleration that dramatically bled off his airspeed. The Zero overshot with such intensity that it passed nearly 100 feet ahead of Carl's nose. Carl swiftly retracted his flaps, thrust his throttle forward, and destroyed the Zero with a precise deflection shot as it attempted to dive away. The Japanese naval aviators were neither unintelligent nor inflexible in their approach. They recognized that American tactics had undergone a significant transformation and made concerted efforts to adapt. By October 1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating over Guadalcanal began to maintain higher altitudes and engage in combat with increased caution. Some adopted slashing attacks reminiscent of the American boom and zoom tactics. However, they confronted a fundamental design limitation. The Zero's design was meticulously optimized for exceptional turning performance at moderate speeds. When Zero pilots attempted to engage in energy battles at high speed and high altitude, they effectively surrendered the inherent advantages their aircraft provided without gaining commensurate benefits. A Zero attempting to execute a boom and zoom maneuver was, at best, mediocre. Conversely, a Wildcat employing energy tactics was skillfully leveraging its intrinsic strengths. I am from your country region. I found the video topic incredibly insightful, highlighting the ingenuity and adaptability of pilots in the face of extreme danger. It's fascinating how specific tactical innovations, born from desperate situations, could completely shift the balance of power in aerial combat. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, unfolding dramatically on November 12–13, 1942, served as a profound illustration of the extent to which American fighter tactics had transformed in a mere 6 months. During this pivotal engagement, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley led a combat air patrol comprising 8 Wildcats when a formidable Japanese strike force began its approach toward the American fleet. Rather than engaging the incoming raid head-on, Flatley strategically situated his division 5,000 feet above the Japanese formation and slightly to its flank, thereby preserving both a superior altitude and a crucial positional energy advantage. His skilled pilots initiated successive high-speed assaults on the bomber formation, with each Wildcat executing 3 or 4 individual boom and zoom runs. The accompanying Zero fighters attempted to intercept these attacks but found themselves perpetually on the defensive, reacting to American moves instead of dictating the flow of the engagement. Ultimately, Flatley's division neutralized 7 bombers and 2 Zeros, suffering no casualties to their own aircraft. The escalation in kill ratios became strikingly evident as the year 1942 drew to a close. Throughout November and December, American fighters operating in the Solomons secured aerial victory rates of nearly 4-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. A deeper understanding of this shift emerged from captured Japanese documents and the interrogations of prisoners, which uncovered an increasing reverence and apprehension concerning American fighter tactics. One Japanese naval aviator, shot down and captured in December 1942, informed his interrogators that Zero pilots had been admonished to shun prolonged aerial contests with American fighters that maintained an altitude advantage, explicitly noting that the Americans no longer fight foolishly. This candid admission underscored the significant psychological and tactical impact of the evolving American approach. Henderson Field, situated amidst the intense fighting, evolved into an unconventional proving ground for aerial strategies, where successful techniques disseminated organically via first-hand guidance from experienced airmen. Seasoned flyers would often mentor fresh recruits individually, demonstrating the precise execution of throttle-down overshoots, explaining how to accurately assess kinetic and potential energy levels, and teaching them to recognize when a Zero pilot was fully engaged in an offensive maneuver. This innovative instruction did not yet constitute official tactical dogma. The training manuals back in the United States continued to primarily advocate conventional turning fights. However, in the crucible of the South Pacific, a new way of fighting was being hammered out by urgent need and honed by the relentless demands of survival. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video for more fascinating insights. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please also share a comment below, letting us know where you are from and what your thoughts are on this compelling topic. By early 1943, both the United States Navy and Marine Corps became aware of a significant challenge. It was, admittedly, an advantageous predicament, but a problem nonetheless. Experienced pilots operating in the Pacific had developed exceptionally potent combat methodologies against Japanese fighters. Yet, this invaluable knowledge resided chiefly within the minds of combat veterans and was only sporadically documented in disparate post-mission analyses. Meanwhile, fresh aviators transitioning directly from domestic instruction were still being taught to engage in close-quarter turning battles, to rely predominantly upon personal skill in air-to-air engagements. The Navy was therefore compelled to formalize what had been acquired through arduous conflict over Guadalcanal, transforming these combat-proven advancements into standardized instructional protocols. The Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, Florida, rapidly emerged as the focal point of this strategic paradigm shift in fighter training. In February 1943, Commander John Thatch himself was recalled from the Pacific with a specific directive to restructure the aerial combat instruction program. Thatch arrived not only with volumes of operational intelligence, onboard weapon camera recordings, and post-mission interview records, but also with something even more indispensable, the authority of a battle-tested leader who had pioneered strategies that consistently proved effective and ensured aviator survival. When Thatch spoke, trainers paid close heed. His assertion that conventional close-quarters maneuvering instruction was proving fatal to flyers prompted the Navy to initiate a comprehensive overhaul of its fighter pilot education. The newly implemented curriculum at Jacksonville and other training bases reflected a total ideological reorientation. Student pilots, for instance, were now tasked with mastering the principles of energy conservation prior to engaging in acrobatic maneuvers. Instructors skillfully employed academic scientific illustrations, such as rolling spheres along inclined planes of varying heights, to elucidate the principles of motion and stored energy. Students could visually apprehend how a ball commencing from a higher elevation, possessing more potential energy, would strike with greater force and travel an extended distance, exhibiting more kinetic energy than one starting lower. The core tenet conveyed was straightforward. Altitude equals energy equals life. The aviator possessing superior altitude, therefore, inherently dictates the engagement. Throttle discipline, specifically, was established as a dedicated instructional unit. Student pilots participated in simulated aerial confrontations, where instructors, piloting more agile planes, would position themselves directly behind the trainees, mimicking an assault by a Zero fighter. The students' objective was to perform power reduction procedures while preserving command over the airplane, carefully calibrating the speed reduction to induce an overshooting error in the pursuing instructor, and then regaining control with sufficient swiftness to transform a defensive posture into an aggressive one. This training was undoubtedly stress-inducing. Decreasing engine power with an instructor on one's tail often seemed self-destructive, yet it effectively developed the instinctive reflexes and assurance necessary to perform the maneuver amidst genuine battle pressure. Instructors consistently noted that trainees who mastered throttle management during this phase exhibited markedly improved chances of remaining alive during their initial trio of operational sorties, a period when inexperienced pilots were exceptionally susceptible to harm. The Fighter Tactics Manual, formally published in May 1943, served to codify the practical insights gleaned by seasoned Pacific aviators. This manual unequivocally declared that pilots should eschew close-in maneuvering contests with Japanese fighters. It provided precise guidance regarding flight elevation and velocity for varying operational scenarios. Furthermore, it delineated the thatch-weave maneuver comprehensively, complete with illustrations depicting intersection points and synchronization. Most importantly, it articulated the underlying rationale for every strategy, not merely prescribing actions, but explaining the scientific principles and mental factors contributing to the efficacy of these methods. This approach was groundbreaking for established military principles, which had historically directed combatants on actions without comprehensive elucidation. Instruction also stressed the importance of rapid identification and critical judgment amidst duress. Students learned to recognize airplane outlines instantaneously and evaluate combat scenarios in mere moments. Questions such as, "Is that enemy aircraft above or below you? What's your comparative velocity? Do you have a superiority in kinetic and potential energy? Can you withdraw if the confrontation deteriorates?" had to become ingrained reflexes, assimilated more swiftly than deliberate cogitation. Instructors engineered high-stress simulations during training flights, mock critical incidents, numerous aggressors, depleted fuel conditions, compelling trainees to render vital choices while simultaneously controlling their airplane's energy profile. Concurrently, the Marine Corps established an analogous instructional framework at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro, situated within California's Imperial Valley. Marine instructors, many of whom were Guadalcanal veterans, brought an even more assertive emphasis to the energy combat philosophy. They stressed that preserving height superiority demanded an arduous level of forbearance. Unseasoned aviators instinctively yearned to descend upon every perceived adversary, expending their energetic superiority for an unlikely successful strike. Seasoned airmen, however, instructed them to exercise restraint, to pursue stealthily, and to strategically situate themselves so perfectly that the adversary remained oblivious to the impending assault until projectiles commenced impact. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a Medal of Honor recipient and a Guadalcanal veteran, powerfully articulated this philosophy to his students. The accomplished aerial combatant exhibits forbearance, strategic thought, and unwavering resolve. Heroism belongs to cinematic portrayals. Effectiveness ensures existence. By mid-1943, every fighter pilot graduating from Navy and Marine Corps training programs had been comprehensively instructed in the principles of energy warfare and power control. They had rehearsed the thatch-weave maneuver until its performance became second nature. They had endured compulsory overspeed exercises until decreasing engine power during a defensive maneuver felt instinctive rather than fear-inducing. They understood implicitly that their Wildcats, Corsairs, or Hellcats were incapable of outmaneuvering a Zero in a turning fight, and thus they would never attempt it. This uniform instructional methodology signified that experienced flight leaders in the Pacific could now have confidence that incoming airmen already grasped the core tenets of combat engagement and self-preservation. The ensuing operational outcomes unequivocally confirmed the efficacy of the instructional commitment. In the second half of 1943, as comprehensively educated aviators surged into Pacific combat units, American fighter-kill ratios over Japanese planes ascended beyond 5-1 and continued their upward trajectory. Critically, these impressive statistics were not solely the accomplishment of highly decorated combat experts. Rather, they were achieved by typical aviators utilizing formalized strategies they had meticulously learned in training. The organizational expertise that had been restricted to seasoned fighters in early 1943 had, by year's end, become universal proficiency throughout the entire aerial combat contingent. The engine power control, once merely a mechanism for speed adjustment, had been repurposed into an offensive instrument that all United States fighter pilots understood how to wield effectively. The throttle-down overshoot technique and the broader energy fighting doctrine it exemplified represented something more significant than merely ingenious air combat maneuvers. They illustrated the remarkable capacity of the United States Armed Forces ethos, when appropriately spurred, to methodically dissect challenges, adjust to adversary advantages, and forge remedies more rapidly than opponents could formulate countermeasures. The Japanese had devoted the decade of the 1930s to refining the Zero fighter and cultivating premier naval airmen to leverage its attributes. Americans, in contrast, dedicated half a year in 1942 to devising methods for counteracting 10 years of Japanese development, then formalized that expertise throughout thousands of aviators. This profound adaptability created a cumulative superiority that reached well beyond isolated aerial duels, fundamentally altering the trajectory of air warfare in the Pacific. By the latter part of 1943, Japanese naval aviation found itself entangled in a dire and self-perpetuating predicament. The elite cadre of its most seasoned aviators, the very veterans who had so decisively dominated the initial stages of the conflict, had been tragically lost. These skilled individuals were systematically shot down by American adversaries, who had, through bitter experience, devised strategies to avoid engaging on Japanese terms. Concurrently, new replacement pilots were subjected to severely truncated training regimens, a direct consequence of Japan's critical shortages in aviation fuel, insufficient time, and a perilous lack of secure airspace necessary for the thorough development of aviators. These raw recruits, lacking the invaluable leadership of their predecessors, were flying the identical Zero aircraft that had instilled fear across the Pacific in 1942. However, they now confronted American pilots who had undergone rigorous, systematic training in innovative tactics specifically engineered to exploit the Zero's inherent vulnerabilities. While the impressive aircraft itself remained unaltered, the caliber and experience of the pilots commanding it had precipitously deteriorated. The calamitous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, unfolding between June 19th and 20th, 1944, served as a stark and undeniable demonstration of this profound shift in aerial superiority. During the intense Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carrier-based fighters, predominantly the formidable F-6F Hellcats, which brilliantly combined the rugged resilience of the Wildcat with substantially enhanced performance capabilities, intercepted colossal waves of Japanese aerial assaults. The American aviators meticulously adhered to strict altitude discipline, skillfully employed energy tactics, and judiciously managed their throttle settings when operational circumstances demanded. The resulting engagement saw the Japanese air forces suffer catastrophic losses, approximately 600 aircraft obliterated over 2 days, while American losses amounted to only about 120, with the vast majority of these attributable to operational mishaps, rather than direct combat engagements. This astonishing disparity resulted in a kill ratio exceeding 10-1, a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never truly recover. It became unequivocally clear that the Zero had not, in fact, become obsolete. Rather, the ingenious tactics developed to neutralize its advantages had simply become universally applied. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. This groundbreaking intellectual framework, which gave rise to the effective throttle-down tactics, profoundly influenced American military thought far beyond the confines of fighter aviation alone. The identical analytical methodology, meticulously examining the enemy's strengths, pinpointing the underlying assumptions that underpinned those strengths, and, subsequently, developing innovative tactics to invalidate those very assumptions, manifested itself across numerous operational domains. For instance, submarine commanders diligently studied Japanese anti-submarine warfare doctrine, then ingeniously devised tactics to exploit its identified weaknesses and gaps. Similarly, bomber formations meticulously analyzed enemy fighter attack patterns, leading to significant modifications in their defensive arrangements and strategies. In essence, the entire military apparatus evolved into a dynamic learning organization, one that no longer perceived enemy capabilities as immutable obstacles, but rather as intricate problems to be systematically dissected and resolved through rigorous analysis and bold tactical innovation. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of this period was how the throttle technique vividly illustrated that success in warfare often favors those bold enough to question established assumptions and challenge conventional wisdom. Traditional fighter doctrine for generations dictated that aerial combat was primarily won through aggressive turning and intricate maneuvering. Every innate instinct screamed that when an adversary was on your tail, the imperative was to accelerate, not to decelerate. The radical notion of deliberately reducing speed when an enemy was in hot pursuit seemed utterly illogical, even suicidal, until a handful of pilots, driven by desperation or blessed with extraordinary creativity, dared to experiment. They soon discovered that such insanity could paradoxically yield far more effective results than adherence to conventional, yet ultimately fatal, logic. Individuals like Jimmy Thack, who meticulously pushed matchsticks around his desk to visualize new maneuvers, Marion Carl, who courageously chopped his throttle with a Zero hot on his heels, and John Smith, who rigorously drilled his pilots never to turn, were not merely performing acts of martial brilliance. They were, more accurately, demonstrating profound intellectual courage, a resolute willingness to attempt something fundamentally different when conventional by-the-book approaches were consistently leading to devastating casualties. The Japanese, regrettably, failed to cultivate a comparable adaptive capacity throughout the duration of the Pacific War. The iconic Zero, a symbol of early Japanese air superiority, remained fundamentally unaltered from 1942 through 1945, even as evolving American tactics progressively rendered its once decisive advantages increasingly irrelevant. Japanese training doctrine stubbornly continued to emphasize individual pilot skill and aggressive head-on engagement, despite the catastrophic decline in the overall quality and experience of their pilot corps. In stark contrast, when American pilots mastered the critical disciplines of throttle control and energy management, that invaluable knowledge was shared systematically and widely throughout their forces. Conversely, while some Japanese pilots undoubtedly developed ingenious techniques to counter American tactics, such hard-won insights rarely disseminated beyond their individual units or squadrons. The very organizational culture that had initially fostered the Zero's unparalleled excellence ultimately proved incapable of adapting, when that initial brilliance became insufficient to meet the new challenges of a rapidly evolving conflict. The profound tactical evolution that commenced with American pilots desperately striving to survive against the formidable Zeros established enduring patterns that would come to define American air combat doctrine for generations, extending through the jet age and well beyond. Pilots flying F-86, Sabres against MiG-15s during the Korean War, for instance, directly applied the energy tactics and throttle management principles derived from their World War II experiences. Later, during the Vietnam era, fighter pilots who had regrettably forgotten these crucial lessons and attempted to engage agile MiG-17s in cumbersome F-4 Phantoms through traditional turn fighting, painfully relearned them. This costly experience directly led to the establishment of revered institutions like Top Gun and other advanced fighter training programs, which vigorously re-emphasized the fundamental energy fighting principles originally developed in the skies over Guadalcanal. Even today, modern fighter pilots are rigorously educated about energy states, the mechanics of overshoots, and the critical importance of controlling engagement geometry, concepts that would be instantly recognizable and understood by pioneers like Jimmy Thatch or Marion Carl. The throttle lever itself, a seemingly mundane and ubiquitous mechanical control, ascended to become a powerful symbol of this monumental transformation. It had always been present in every cockpit, a simple device manipulated by every pilot dozens of times during a single flight. Yet for an extended period no one conceived of it as a potent weapon until the crucible of combat circumstances forced a radical shift in creative perception. This encapsulates the essential overarching lesson: the very tools required to resolve complex problems frequently already exist within our grasp. What is truly demanded is the visionary insight to perceive familiar objects in entirely novel ways, the unwavering courage to embark upon unconventional approaches, and the rigorous discipline to systematically teach and propagate what proves effective. American fighter pilots in 1942 did not passively await the arrival of superior aircraft to overcome the Zero. Instead, they ingeniously utilized the aircraft at their disposal, the immutable laws of physics governing all flight, and the boundless creativity that desperation often unlocks. They deliberately pulled the throttle back, defying every natural instinct that urged them to push it forward. In doing so, they dramatically inverted the roles, transforming the hunters into the hunted, rendering Japan's most formidable aerial weapon into an antiquated relic, and conclusively demonstrating that adaptation invariably triumphs over perfection when that perfection proves incapable of adapting. The Zero pilots who, with unwavering confidence, committed to pursuit, fully anticipating another effortless victory, instead found themselves catastrophically overshooting past their intended target, suddenly and terrifyingly vulnerable in the final moments of their lives. The throttle had, in its profound simplicity, delivered its decisive judgment.